Alright, so today we're going to go over solving trig equations with factoring. And I'm going to do 4 problems, and then I'm going to do another video with using identities. So here's the one on just factoring. So if I have 2 sine squared of t plus 3 sine of t plus 1 equals 0. Now, in all cases, these are going to be the hard kind of factoring where the leading coefficient is not 1. So let's go over that and how you do it. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to take the first number and the last number, and you're going to multiply them. And that gives you 2. Then you look at the factors of that number. So if 2 factors into 1 times 2. Now does that add up to give you 3? Yes, it does. So you know that that's the 2 numbers that you want. So now here's the second step. So I'm going to copy down my first term. Then I'm going to split this second term into 2 terms. So this is now going to be plus 1 sine of t plus 2 sine of t. Alright, so you see how I have the 1 is here and the 2 is here. And 1 plus 2 gives me 3. Alright, and then plus, copy down the plus 1 and copy down the equals 0. So now I have 4 terms. Alright, so looking at my first 2 terms, I have a common factor of the sine of t. Right? So if I take out the sine of t, if I factor out that common factor, sine of t into 2 sine squared of t, this sine of t cancels with one of those sines of t's, and I'm left with 2 sine of t. And then over here, sine of t and sine of t just cancel, so I'm left with plus 1. In the second 2 terms, I don't have anything common, so I just factor out a 1. Because 1 divides into everything. And I'm left with 2 sine of t plus 1 equals 0. Now, notice now I have 2 terms. And it helps sometimes if you underline them. So what's common to those 2 terms? Well, look, they both have 2 sine of t plus 1 in them. And so I'm going to factor out the 2 sine of t plus 1. And if I do that, then these, when I divide this into this and this into this, just like I did with the sine of t here, I'll be left with sine of t plus 1. And so that gives me, if 2 sine of t plus 1 equals 0, then 2 sine of t equals negative 1, subtract the 1, and then divide by 2. So sine of t is equal to negative 1/2. And over here, if I have sine of t plus 1 equals 0, then I get sine of t equals negative 1. And so now I have 2 different equations that I'm solving for. So I have a possibility of 4 answers here, because I could have 2 triangles from this one and 2 triangles from this one. And so let's look at our triangles for this one. So the sine is negative. So let's figure out our quadrants. So all students take calculus. So this one is going to be positive. Sine is positive in the first 2 quadrants, so it's negative in the second 2. So I'll be in the 3rd quadrant and the 4th quadrant. And then notice my opposite is going to be 1, and my hypotenuse is going to be 2. So this would be negative 1 and 2, negative 1 and 2. And then, of course, this would be square root of 3, and this would be negative square root of 3. So my reference angle here is a 30-degree angle, or pi over 6. Now, on this one, I want all of the answers that are between 0 and 2 pi. All right, so this one is going to be, here's pi, here's 2 pi. So my first one would be that pi plus pi over 6. And my second one, and so that would give me over 6. So multiply numerator and denominator by 6. I get 6 pi over 6 plus pi over 6 gives me 7 pi over 6. Now this one, notice I could call it negative pi over 6 is what I usually do. But that's not the answers they want. They want the answers to be between 0 and 2 pi. So this one I'm going to have to go 2 pi and then back pi over 6. Minus pi over 6. And so this one needs to be a denominator of 6, so multiply numerator and denominator by 6. I get 12 pi over 6 minus pi over 6 gives me 11 pi over 6. So there are my two answers from this factor. Now, on this one, notice it's equal to 1. So I don't have triangles here. This is on the axis. And so let's look at my 4 points on the axis. So this is over 1 up 0, over 0 up 1, over negative 1 up 0, over 0 down 1. So here I'm looking, remember the sign of t on the unit circle is equal to the y coordinate. And so my y-coordinate equals to negative 1 happens right here. And this is 3 pi over 2. Or if you prefer, you can go over 2 pi and back 1, and that would be 2 pi minus pi over 3. Or you can go pi plus pi over 2. So this would be over 2, so that would give me 3 pi over 2. But you should know that this is pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 4 pi over 2 would be 2 pi. Now, problem number 2 is, let me get a new piece of paper. Four cosine squared of x minus 7 cosine of x plus 3 equals 0. So again, I take my first number, my leading coefficient, and then my last term. And they should always be in descending powers of x. So this would be 4 times 3 equals 12. So now I'm going to look at all of the factors of 12. So that would be 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. All right, so 3 and 4, I'm looking now to see what adds up to give me my middle term. So 3 and 4 add up to give me 7. So I have the right number, but the wrong sign. So I just change both of my signs. So this would be negative 3 and negative 4. And so now I'm going to rewrite the first term. I'm going to split the 7 cosine of x into negative 3 cosine of x and negative 4 cosine of x. So minus 3 cosine of x minus 4 cosine of x plus 3. Again, I have 4 terms. What's common to my first 2 terms? Well, cosine of x goes into both of them. And if I divide the cosine of x into each of them, cosine of x into cosine of x, 4 cosine squared of x, this one cancels with one of those, so I get 4 cosine of x minus, and then again, the cosine of x just cancel, and I get 3. Now, if this middle term here is negative, then you want to take out a negative number. And so if I look, again, there's nothing in common, so I'm going to take out a negative 1. And I'm left with negative into negative gives me positive 4 cosine of x, and negative into positive gives me negative 3. Now I have two terms. Now, notice that if I forget to divide this 3 by a negative, then I would have a 4 cosine of x plus 3 here. And that's the most common mistake that's made. But notice that if I do that, then these two terms wouldn't be the same. These have to be the same because you have to have a common factor. So if they're not the same, then just go ahead and see what you did wrong in the first two steps. All right, so now I'm going to take out the 4 cosine of x minus 3. And so I'm going to get rid of this, get rid of this. I'm taking them out, factoring them out. They're the common factor. And what am I left with? Cosine of x in the first term and minus 1 in the second term. And so if 4 cosine of x minus 3 equals 0, bring the 3 over. 4 cosine of x equals 3, and divide by 4. So I get cosine of x equals 3/4. So this will give me 2 of the triangles. Now this is not one of the triangles that we know. So I'm going to have to use my calculator. And so my reference triangle will be equal to the inverse cosine of 3/4. So on my calculator, I'm going to go make sure that I'm in radians, and I am not. Hang on one second. Okay, so now I'm in radians, and I'm going to go 3 divided by 4 inverse cosine. Oh, I forgot to hit equals. 3 divided by 4 equals, and then inverse cosine. So I get 0.723. Now, notice that the cosine is positive here. And so if I look at my quadrants, all students take calculus. Cosine is positive in the first and the fourth quadrant. And so this is 0.723, and this reference angle is 0.723. All right, so the first one is in the first quadrant, so it's just going to be 0.723, and that's the answer. But the second one, I have to go all the way around and then back. So this is 2 pi, so it would be 2 pi minus 0.723. So on my calculator, I'm going to go, and let's see, I don't see a pi. This is a new calculator. So I'll just use 3.142 times 2, and then minus 0.723. And that gives me 5.561. So this factor gave me 2 answers, just like normal. Now, notice on this one, though, I have cosine of x minus 1 equals 0. So if I add the 1, I get cosine of x equals 1. So this gives me, this is going to be on my axes. So this is over 1 up 0, over 0 up 1, over negative 1 up 0, over 0 down 1. And remember, the cosine of x is the x-coordinate on my unit circle. So I'm looking for where is the cosine equal to 1, and it's right here at 0. So 0 would be my other answer. Okay, looks like we have time to do just one more problem on this video. So let's do this one. Problem number 3. 4 sine squared of x minus 2 sine of x minus 2 equals 0. Now notice on this one that you have everything is divisible by 2. So if I divide both sides of the equation by 2, it'll make my factoring easier. So this would be 2 sine of x minus sine of x minus 1 equals 0. Okay? And so now, once again, I'm going to go 2 times, and notice the sign goes with the number here. 2 times negative 1 is negative 2. So negative 2 factors into negative 1 or 2 and 2, which gives me, if I add this, notice this is 1, right? And so if I add this, this gives me 1, which is the right number, but it's the wrong sign. I want it to be negative 1. So I'm going to change both of the signs. So change this to plus and this to minus. All right? And so now if I multiply them, I still get negative 2. And if I add them, now I get negative 1. And that's what I want. All right? So now, looking at this, I'm going to bring down my 2 sine of x. And then I'm going to factor this into plus 1 sine of x. And then minus 2 sine of x minus 1. All right? So now, again, factor out the sine of x. I'm sorry, this should be sine squared of x. So factor out the sine of x, and I get 2 sine of x plus 1, dividing both of these by sine of x. And then again, if this is negative, take out a negative. Nothing's in common, so I'm going to take out a negative 1. And I'm left with 2 sine of x plus 1. Because a negative and a negative, negative and a negative. So both of them will be positive. All right? So now, looking, I have 2 terms. They both have 2 sine of x plus 1. And if I take that out, what am I left with? Well, in this term, I'm left with sine of x and minus 1. So this gives me 2 sine of x plus 1 equals 0. So 2 sine of x equals negative 1, subtracting the 1, and then dividing by 2. So sine of x is equal to negative 1/2. All right? And this one, we've already done on the first problem, and it came out to be 7 pi over 6 and 11 pi over 6. All right, so those were the 2 answers that we got from this one. And then here I have sine of x equals negative 1. And so that will become, and again, 1, 0 over 0 up 1 over 1, negative 1 up 0, and over 0 down 1. And so where is the y coordinate? Equal to negative 1, and that would be here at 3 pi over 2. All right? And then the last problem is going to be 4 cosine squared of x minus 4 equals 15 cosine of x. So again, I'm going to have to bring this over here to set it equal to 0 so I can factor it. So 4 cosine squared of x, and put it in descending powers of cosine of x. And so I'm going to take the 4, the first term and the last term, times negative 4 equals negative 16. And so that would be negative 1. and 16, negative 2 and 8, negative 4 and 4. I'm trying to get 15. Well, that gives me 15 here, but it's the right number, wrong sign, so I change both signs. So this would be 4 cosine squared of x plus cosine of x minus 16 cosine of x minus 4. So now I have 4 terms, factor out the cosine of x, and this should be 1 here. And you get cosine of x times 4 cosine of x plus 1. And then take out the negative 4, because notice 4 goes into both of them, and also get the negative out. And you get 4 cosine of x plus 1 equals 0. So now I have 2 terms, and I have 4 cosine of x plus 1 equals 0, times cosine of x minus 4 equals 0. So 4 cosine of x plus 1 equals 0 gives me 4 cosine of x equals negative 1, and divide by 4. Cosine of x equals negative 1/4. So here I'll have 2 triangles, and again, all students take calculus, and using my calculator and in radians, and I'm just going to use my theta reference is equal to cosine inverse of 1/4. So you do the positive one. So I get 1 divided by 4 equals, and then inverse cosine, 1.318. All right? And so this would be 1.318, or 1.318. And so the first one would be pi minus 1.318, and the second one would be pi plus 1.318. So over here, I would have the cosine of x minus 4 equals 0, and I get cosine of x equals 4. And if I try to do that, this would be the inverse cosine of 4. And notice if I punch that in my calculator, I get an error. Because remember, you can only get numbers between 1 and negative 1. So 4 is not a good answer. So that one's not going to work. All right, and so that gives you all of the problems that I was going to work with that have to do with factoring.